Hello and welcome back to the County Chat previews for 2025. We're continuing on with our previews. I say they're previews, obviously we're well into the County Championship season at this point, but more just looking into how the season itself and how these teams are doing and how they're looking maybe throughout to the end of the year. So anyway, kind of continuing on, we've been going from last to first, so we're all the way up to the penultimate team we'll be previewing for 2025, and it is the only county cricket club beginning with H. They call the Utilita Bowl home. I would always say it's a sort of spiritual home of COVID cricket. They had the sort of the hotel attached to the ground, so all the games seem to be played at Hampshire. And yeah, as as sort of alluding to now, is they often a forgotten about side in close run title races against Surrey, who are obviously the other team we yet to preview. It is, of course, Hampshire. So as I say, I feel like Hampshire is sort of slightly the forgotten side, really, when it comes to recent title races and recent teams that have been kind of consistently good. Hampshire were well within the title race last year, and even were close enough to it that they actually lost less games than Surrey did. Surrey just got a few more wins and drew fewer games. But Hampshire, yeah, as it goes, actually lost fewer. They only lost one last year. And so as I sort of saying, for some reason, I guess it could just be my perspective. I could be like the only one who thinks this, but they're kind of a forgotten about team. I feel like Surrey and Somerset and Essex are often talked about as sort of the top three. Obviously Surrey being obvious, but Hampshire I feel like are forgotten about often in that kind of top tier of teams in the last sort of 3 or 4 years. But yeah, they've kind of always been in and around it, and they've had always a very strong team with a kind of a consistent setup. And yeah, it's sort of interesting to see what they'll be looking like. And I think similar to Somerset, I've written here, I think Essex and Surrey and Warwickshire have got some titles in the last decade, and obviously Surrey have dominated. But I think teams like Hampshire and Somerset could kind of count themselves unlucky that they're just at one point results didn't go their way, or they didn't get it over the line near the end of the season and to actually win a title in the last decade. But anyway, moving on to sort of looking at Hampshire for 2025 and how they've started the season and all of that, and as we've been doing on these videos. So anyway, the head coach, it's Adrian Beryl. He remains the head coach and has been since 2018. He's sort of, as I've been mentioning, that same sort of period of history we've just been mentioning for Hampshire. He's been at the helm of all of that. And yeah, it's been a period of relative success for Hampshire, I think, compared to maybe their history as a club. I think Hampshire's been going through a really good time. Obviously, they've had probably the most successul T20 Blast team in that time. I think they've won a one-day cup in that time as well. So Hampshire's been a well-run, well-organised setup for a while now. And yeah, Adrian Beryl, and not a name I knew before I did the research with this video, but he's been clearly at the helm of it because he's been around since 2018. Though, of course, there has been a change in red ball cricket. It was a bit of a story during the winter, but James Vince kind of announced he'll no longer be available for first-class cricket, I guess retiring from red ball cricket, which therefore ends a 10-year stint as the club captain. You know, James Vince has been not only sort of the classic county championship Instagram, great aesthetically pleasing cover shots vibe, but he's also been, the club captain for 10 years for Hampshire to this point when he gave up the captaincy. Without knowing for a fact, I would have to assume that's probably the longest stint. Maybe Rory Burns, similar length of time amongst any county championship captain. So yeah, it proves that he's been around for a long time, and it'll be a big replacement within the sort of leadership side. And obviously, we'll get onto his batting in the preview sort of element itself. But he'll be replaced by another lad born in Sussex. Couldn't help but sneak that one in there. But as Crawley's Ben Brown replaces Cookfield's James Vince, Brown captained Sussex for quite a long time himself, so he's got plenty of sort of experience in that role. And before his sort of, I've written here, unceremonious exit, you can tell I'm not quite over it yet from the county. I think he's been always described, Ben Brown, as kind of a natural leader, and I think it probably was one of those things he just fell quite naturally into a sort of a vice captain role quite quickly. And then when Vincey decided it was, I say Vincey like I know him, James Vince, when he decided enough was enough for red ball cricket, that Ben Brown would be the perfect man to take over, and he has done so far. Anyway, so with all that being said, as we always do, we sort of focus on their weaker aspect of the two phases of the game, batting and bowling, and we'll stick with that this time. Anyway, so onto it. With the loss of their best batter, it's a fairly straight line towards saying the batting will be the limit for the Hampshire in the title charge, or their attempted title charge in 2025. James Vince is gone. We'll talk about him when we get to the number 3 slot, which is not a long time, but batting is what I've decided is Hampshire's sort of weakness. And we'll get into it now. The openers, we'll start with a new signing for them. Mark Stoneman, who after having after a few pretty lean seasons for Middlesex, in Division 2, might I add. Stoneman, the 37-year-old, who will be 38 as of a few weeks' time. I think he's 38 in June. As I sort of said in the Middlesex preview, for those of you who might have watched it, I'm not quite sure of how savvy this signing will prove to be. He's not had a brilliant start to the season. I think he's only got 150 amongst the first 6 games, and I know against Sussex this morning he has got out for a duck. It's be interesting to see how his season goes. He's one of those. He's an incredibly talented batter. He's just, he's on the end of that ageing curve. He's scored 12,000 first-class runs. He's got plenty under his belt. It's just whether or not his best is behind him, and I think maybe it is, unfortunately. He's been consistently pretty joined by youngster Fletcher Middleton. He's been averaging just under 30 at the top of the order for the last sort of 3 years. I think he's one of those players. He's got a lot of talent. He's a young guy, as I mentioned, but I just think it's not a top order, which I think you would say is striking the fear into the hearts of the excellent bowling units of Division 1. It's sort of a similar thing that we spoke about when we came to Somerset, and that was the limiting factor. And you think about some really excellent opening pairs within Division 1, I think it's safe to say that Hampshire's wouldn't sort of fall within that. Another reason I sort of find the Stoneman signing a slight peculiar one is the presence of Ali Orr. Ali Orr, for Sussex fans will know of him. He played for Sussex and looked brilliant for sort of 2 or 3 years. Born in Eastbourne, very much a product of Sussex. And then he went to Hampshire, and after having kind of a good start, had a really, really struggled towards 2024, and has been dropped out of the side this year, of course. But he still averages, amongst his career, which is about 4 years long, let's say, he averages 37 with the bat, which is far, far higher than the younger batters around him, including Toby Albert, who we'll get onto, who's been batting sort of further down the order. But he's also seen as an opener, as Felix Organ is as well, and then, of course, as I mentioned, Fletcher Middleton and Mark Stoneman. He has been smashing in runs for the second 11 to start the season. I had a little look because I just couldn't imagine Ali Orr playing second 11 cricket and that not being the case. If you've seen him play, he's one of those batters when he's just on top of the bowlers. There's nowhere to bowl. Tall man, hits the ball hard. So it'll be interesting to see sort of if he sort of gets a chance this season. He hasn't so far, and he will definitely be a part of their white ball setup, as I've sort of alluded to with his, hitting the ball so hard and sort of how he plays his cricket. But in my opinion, he should be well within the shouts for openers within their red ball setup. And that's just my view. I haven't seen much of Fletcher Middleton and Toby Albert, but I think they'd have to be very, very good young players to be a better setup than Ali Orr. And someone he's sort of becoming towards his mid-20s, it just feels like if he's already averaged 37 in about 30 first-class matches, why not give him a go? Despite having, he had a bad 2024 in red ball cricket, but again, it just feels like maybe an interesting one that he hasn't had a shot yet, and whether or not he'll need to move on from Hampshire to get that chance again. Anyway, at 3, as I mentioned, James Vince is almost impossible to replace. I mean, I think if you looked at, I didn't look season by season, but if you just do it numbers wise, he's scored about 13,000 runs and has probably played first class cricket for the last 10 to 13 years or 10 to 15 years. So, I mean, doing very basic maths, he quite consistently scores around 1,000 runs a season. So it's kind of impossible to replace that. I think, those kind of batsmen don't grow on trees, if you will. But the internal replacement they have with Nick Gubbins feels like a very, natural one. I think it's as best as you could really hope for, maybe within not signing someone for a hell of a lot of money. He's a proven scorer of runs. He's got 8,550 runs at 37 throughout his career. I think the reality is he's just going to be put under a lot of pressure this season. When he's sort of batting, because I just don't think those openers, especially if they stick with the openers they have at the moment, I just don't think we'll kind of be getting them deep enough into games. I mean, this morning being a great example, he came in the fifth ball, the first over is what I meant to say. he's been, he's long been a part of Hampshire's important part of Hampshire's setup. Originally from Middlesex, and was a part of their county championship winning team all the way back in 2016. So he's one of those players. He stayed the course, and he's a really good player. He often was connected with England in the sort of late 2010s. So yeah, I think he's in a good place to sort of continue on in a good way. So yeah, following him in the lineup, I've got them the wrong way around here. It's Tom Prest. Tom Prest I've got Ben Brown before him on my script. Tom Prest has definitely been their number 4. He's this incredibly young batter who's incredibly talented. He's done very, very well, Tom Prest, across sort of multiple formats, and scored a lot of one-day runs. But I think if I were to say who needs to step up, I think it's kind of a passing of the torch moment maybe. He's 22, I think, Tom Prest, and he's got all the talent to be the level of James Vince, and I mean that, and that's a lofty expectation for any young cricketer. And I think, his 3 centuries last year, he's been highly talented for a while, but his 3 centuries last year maybe proved to himself that he's here to stay. He didn't, despite having those 3 centuries, he didn't have like a huge year. I think it was in the 700 run range, maybe even 600 run range. So I think the kind of classic passing of the torch. I think Hampshire will hope that Tom Prest will be a player that they can kind of see in the middle of their order and know for the next 10 or so years they've got someone that can bank for a lot of runs, because he's got all the talent for it, as I say. Following him in the lineup, sort of Tom Preston's lineup, is Ben Brown, the skipper. He's a brilliant wicketkeeper batter. I think for any team, if you see a player who's a wicketkeeper batter who averages around 40, I think he's just shy of 40, and with very, very, very handy glove work, it is just a win for your team. I think it's as simple as that. It's not. Those kind of players don't really come around very often, and they're not always around. Other players who similarly to that, think of John Simpson down at Sussex now, Ben Folkes for Surrey, Jordan Cox for Essex, and Ollie Robinson for Durham. I think those kind of players that really set apart some of the better sides maybe in the setup of the county cricket. And Ben Brown is a bit older; he's 36 now, so they'll hope he can kind of be the business for him. He scored plenty of runs for Sussex. I remember when I was sort of a young Sussex fan, and since he's moved to Hampshire, has been quality. I think there's the reason he's become the club captain. So it's as simple as that. He is just the business, really, and his leadership, I think, is highly looked at from all sort of angles and all aspects. Anyway, in around 6, and kind of consistently has been for Hampshire over the last decade, it's perhaps my favourite county cricketer, maybe not from the county I support, but he's finally returned to the England setup in the T20. But it's all-rounder Liam Dawson. Last year he scored just shy of 1,000 runs at an average of 60. And we'll get onto his wickets later and his bowling just generally later, but a frontline spinner who has scored over 10,000 runs in his first-class career is, any club or any team for that matter, or country, in my opinion, should take that and just run with it. I mean, I think I'm not going to get into a long thing about Liam Dawson. I think he might be a part of a longer video I do about England's selection policy, but the fact that he hasn't played more test matches for England, I just can't get my head round, especially with the struggles England have had with spinners. He's a brilliant control option, but also is a batter who is seriously talented and knows how to get runs. I think it's not something you can underestimate. Is a player who's scored that many runs. They just know how to get the runs for the team. I think he would have been a great option for England when they were picking Jack Leach a lot. I think Jack Leach is probably a better spinner, but I think if you're adding a batter who averages 35 with the bat, it's a good trade-off, and he's got that control element. But anyway, we'll get into his bowling, as I say, and as I say, it's sort of a separate point is where Liam Dawson's England career could have gone had he been played. But that is perhaps for another video, as I mentioned. Also, speaking of things I sort of previously mentioned, Toby Albert, he's kind of been consistently sort of being around the bottom of the order. I say bottom of the order, but you know what I mean. For a top order batter, he's been batting sort of no higher than 6 so far this season. Again, he's similar to Prest. He sort of established himself with a couple of hundreds last season, and they were the kind of first few he'd got on red ball cricket. So I think he just needs to, I think he's getting a lot of opportunity this year, and he just needs to establish himself. I don't think he's done brilliantly this year. I think he's got a 50, but I think a lot of Hampshire's batting lineup, I think is looking for maybe some higher level of high level of just talent and high level of performance. As the talent's there, the performance needed to come to to fill in that, to Hampshire to put their bowlers in a position to win games. In the one game he's played so far, but Felix Organ is a really talented all-rounder. He did very well in that game against Durham and scored 70. He's sort of an opening batter turned all-rounder because his spin has been very good, and it'd be interesting to see sort of where he falls, because he averages in the low 20s as a batter, but has opened the batting and scored hundreds from the top of the order. So he's a bit of an interesting case, Felix Organ. Sort of see where he goes with his season, because I batted, I think when he got that 70, he batted 8 this season. So whether or not they get rid of a Mark Stoneman at the top of the order and he ends up opening, it remains to be seen. Lastly, for the sort of the batting unit, if you will, and there's, or as always with these teams, there's a few batters you might miss out, but I just don't see them getting picked or playing. James Fuller even. He sort of fleshes out that lower order, if you will. You could say as a filler. The 35-year-old has made a great start to his 2025 after a bit of a struggle in 2024, which we'll get onto with his bowling. But he's one of those, he's a kind of a classic cricketer, and once he's kind of got going maybe with the bat, his bowling kind of picks up, and I think he can kind of take a team with him, and he can be quite a match-winning player at times. Anyway, on to this bowling lineup. The bowling lineup took a few sort of kind of major blows, you'd say, during the off-season, as Mohammed Abbas left for Nottinghamshire, which again, it sort of helps a direct rival who's sort of entering that title fray, and Nottinghamshire have really looked well within that team. I somehow managed to sort of miss that signing when I did the Nottinghamshire preview, so I wasn't mentioning how good of a signing he was, but Mohammed Abbas leaving Hampshire I think is a huge deal, and I go on to talk about that a lot in this script, but a bit of an oversight from me there. And so it's Nottinghamshire have now kind of entered the title fray a lot and have been helped by the supplementing of Mohammed Abbas. Another blow was to Hampshire was the suspension of Keith Barker. It was due to a failed drugs test, and it seems to all reports it was a mistake, sort of a new version of a medication he'd been taking and had always used. He just didn't know there was a banned substance within it. I think it got proven that he wasn't trying to cheat with it, and again, it's always difficult to know with these professional athletes, because you just think, how would you not find that one out? But Keith Barker is one of my favourite cricketers. It was a real shame when I saw that. It was, I'm sure he's played plenty of cricket, and he's a tough miss. I think I would have mentored him in the batting. He averages nearly 30 with the bat, and he's predominantly a bowler. He's scored I think 6 or 7 first-class hundreds. And is taken nearly 600 wickets or something. I mean, he's got a really serious lineup. Thankfully for Hampshire, his suspension only runs until early July, because it was sort of retrospectively done from the early July of last year, and he got a year suspension, so he'll be able to be back for the back half of the season, which I think will be a massive deal for Hampshire. But I think it just the sort of the absence of these two stalwarts is a big deal for Hampshire's lineup, and especially their bowling lineup in 2025, and it certainly has a different feel to it. I think with Hampshire, it was one of those teams where you really were kind of consistently, you saw Carl Abbott, Mohammed Abbas, Keith Barker, sort of back to back. You knew they were going to get wickets and knew they were going to be on the money. Anyway, speaking of Carl Abbott, the one here, he's kind of the exception to the fact of the new look lineup for them. Last year he was at his excellent best, but the reality is it's just on with his career averages. He took 55 wickets at an average of 20. His bowling average across his career is 20. And somehow he's looking even better this season. Not many bowlers can do a season like that, 55 wickets at an average of 20, and in the 6 matches in the next season look even better. He's taken 31 wickets at an average of 16. And it seems just like, the broad shoulders of this big South African, he's just taken all that extra pressure on those shoulders, and it's looked like nothing. It's just looked like he's had more opportunities to bowl, which is almost certainly the case, and therefore taken more wickets. Abbott, especially on pitches, which I think this season have been noticeably a bit more mundane for an early season pitches. You've had less of those real green seamers for the start of the season. But as a man, who grew up in South Africa, the pitches haven't really bothered him. He hasn't seemed to care. He hasn't really changed his abilities, and he's extracted movement I think few others have. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I think he's going to have an even bigger season just because he has less bowlers to bowl those overs to take those wickets. But then again, maybe that will kind of come against him nearer the end of the season because he's having to bowl so often. But I'll be honest, I'd be surprised if that's the case. Is Carl Abbott just seems like one of those players who just is always taking wickets at a low economy and a low average. So long may it continue for Hampshire's perspective. It's a signing which has kind of been hoped to sort of stop that gap of Abbas and suspension of Barker is Sonny Baker from Somerset. He's a really highly touted young quick. He's looked the part at points during this season. He took a fifer against Surrey, and but the reality is at this stage of his career, his skills are just nowhere near the level of Abbas's. He's a really good player, bowls quick. But he will be aided by Carl Abbott just in the sort of the training aspect, but also in the literal game by game. If you're bowling in a pair with Carl Abbott, it's going to help you. And the other sort of seamer who's definitely got some more bowling because of the Abbas and Barker debacles, Brad Wheel has been the other seam bowler predominantly used so far this season, and he's looked good. He's had a couple of fourfers, but still his bowling average is well above the 30 mark, and same goes for Baker. I think this in many ways points out just how absurdly good Abbott is and how absurdly good Abbas and Barker were as kind of the pairs for Abbott. But yeah, they're kind of good players to sort of fill those gaps, but I think it's safe to say they're not of the level of the players they're replacing. I spoke of James Fuller in there, sort of the batting bit, but he really struggled in 2024. He took his 12 wickets at an average of 71.5, and didn't get selected in those first few games, which I guess was maybe a surprise because of the absence of a player like Barker. But having sort of had that happen, he sort of roared into form, and sort of the kind of pièce de résistance of that was a fifer and a 50 not out at Edgbaston. Excuse me. And yeah, he just has generally started the season very well. As I mentioned in the batting, he's that kind of classic county cricket all-rounder. And he's taken his 16 wickets at 18, so he's already passed his wicket total for last year. And he's just, I didn't see much from him bowl last year, but he's looked the part this season, that's for sure. And he's taken wickets to make it sort of stick, if you will. Another pace bowler that they have, a sort of highly touted one again, is John Turner. He'd be looking for a big season. He's played barely any professional cricket, but he's already played for England multiple times. I think that shows the kind of level of bowler he is. He's rapid. I think England like all the looks of his kind of natural abilities. And so far this season, he's taken 4 wickets at an average 21. A tiny sample size, but hey, you've got to see what you see, and you've got to like what you like. And he bowled quite well again in a very small sample size in 2024. So whether or not for the 24-year-old, I think he is. It's going to be one of those seasons where it's a bit of a maturing one, and he bowls a lot more overs. And I think he's mates with Michael Booth, who's had a similar thing at Warwickshire. He's sort of finally grown into that kind of level of age and body where you maybe as a fast bowler you can sort of keep up with those more overs. So we will see. Lastly, for that sort of seam bowling battery for Hampshire, is a bit of a bolter this season in Eddie Jack. He had a really good winter for England under-19s, and then was selected in the sort of county select 11 that played Zimbabwe in the warm-up match, and obviously turned them over. And he did really well, took 5 wickets in that match and looked really good. Following that, he's then got an England Lions selection, against India A, which is a huge deal for him, despite not having made a first-class debut as of yet for Hampshire. But yes, I guess Hampshire will hope that they can kind of get a sort of, after he's having a sort of breakout season as a young seamer, that he can kind of contribute towards them, maybe towards the back end of the year, or maybe back, and he certainly will be contributing for them for the white ball cups and various things. But yeah, for their sake, Hampshire will hope they can kind of take some of the use of his sort of upswing and maybe form and talent, and perhaps just confidence as a simple one. Anyway, on to the spinners for Hampshire. I guess, as you will know exactly where I'm going with this, is Liam Dawson. As I mentioned in the batting section, he's one of the most outstanding talents in county cricket for sort of the sum of all his skills. And I think what makes him stand out, and the reason why, again, not going to go into the England Liam Dawson debate, but he's had a career bowling average beneath 3, and I think having bowlers who have that level of control is just a really valuable thing in red ball cricket. And last year was, I don't know if it was his career year, but it was must be right up there, because he took 54 wickets at an average of 25. Bearing in mind his bowling average for his career is nearer 32, 33. I think his control and again those subtle variations, he's one of those classic bowlers. It's not big variations, he's not got the big doos or anything, it's just those slight seam angles, slight arm slots. And he's just a perfect control bowler for any captain to lean upon, which I'm sure Ben Brown has been doing so far this season, will continue to do for Hampshire. But yeah, Liam Dawson is sort of as good as it gets. And as I've mentioned, for sort of other top tier spinners within these previews, so say Simon Harmer and Jack Leach, for example, the sort of, I mean, we've had a bit of rain in the last week, but how dry the pitches and how dry the spring we've had in the UK has been will mean that these bowlers are looking at these pitches going forward to the end of the season and thinking, wow, we could really dine out on some, 10 wicket matches and stuff like that. So we will see if Hampshire, if Dawson can kind of outdo his last season, and I think that would be a serious effort to outdo his last season. That's just because of how good it was. But I think he's just at the peak of his powers, and he's just a great bowler. And I think it will be interesting to see how his season sort of pans out after sort of a near 1,000-run, 50-wicket season last year, which is pretty rare. Another spinning option that Hampshire have is the youngster Felix Organ. As I mentioned, he's kind of had an interesting career. He sort of started as an opening batter who could bowl a bit of spin, but it's sort of almost, his batting was not as effective as they hoped, and his bowling probably was more effective than they hoped, because he averages in the low 20s with the bat. But he's across sort of 4 years of professional cricket, he's taken 61 wickets at an average of 28. So I mean, he's, as a batting all-rounder, that's a really, really good average, a really, really solid place. And of course, he's often only coming on when the ball is turning sideways and all of that kind of thing, and even probably more recently only getting selected when the pitches are doing that. But yeah, Felix Organ is probably someone, again, he's going to be incredibly valuable, having Liam Dawson as a sort of mentor, I'm sure. And yeah, he's always looked the part, and his spin always looks very, very good from a sort of uninitiated spin bowling perspective. Anyway, overall for Hampshire, I still think they have all the talent to be at the top of the table. I do feel like, I just think simply they've lost more talent in 2025 than they gained from 2024, if that makes sense. Vince and Abbas are the obvious ones. I think if you looked at the kind of contributions over the last 3 or 4 years, you'd probably say Vince and Abbas were in the top two of the top 5 contributors for Hampshire. So just losing them is a really big deal, and I know Hampshire would have known that. But the replacements, the kind of direct replacements they had in Baker and Stoneman are just, I think, especially at this kind of they're not of the same caliber of player, and I think especially at this point of their career, Stoneman maybe if they had signed a 30-year-old Mark Stoneman, I'd be saying something very different. And Sonny Baker, he's just a very young cricketer. He's a 22-year-old. And just to be of the talent level of someone like Mohammad Abbas at that age, it's just unlikely. Simply put, I think Mohammad Abbas hadn't even made a sort of first-class debut at that time. So again, it's not really to sort of bash those two players particularly. It's just a bit of a what came in does not match what came out sort of thing. I mean, they also moved on, not something I mentioned throughout, but they also moved on from Ian Holland on a sort of permanent basis. They loaned him out to Leicestershire last year, and then they've let him go. He's having a brilliant start to his season for Leicestershire, and Leicestershire are an absolute flying. So I wonder whether or not they'll be looking at it sort of a bit like, oh wow, it would be handy to have Ian Holland in our setup right now. Maybe not. But it's an interesting one again. It's another talented cricketer who's left the doors of Hampshire in the last little while. I think players such as Tom Preston, Ben Brown, I think they'll need, in the batting department, they'll need to have bigger seasons. And again, it's just making up for, I think, and Nick Gubbins, obviously, but it's just making up for sort of someone like James Vince. And it is about 1,000 runs a season you're trying to make up from other sort of the sum of the parts that are left. And it's just an interesting one to see. Similarly, on the sort of bowling side of it, bowlers like Wheel, Fuller and Turner and Baker, as I mentioned, will need to make up for those sort of lost wickets of Abbas and Barker to begin this season. I think, Hampshire have got plenty of talent in their lineup and plenty of strength and depth in their squad. So I'm sure they will continue to be of the standard. I just think it's whether or not they've replaced near title winning side, and the players that have left are not of the title winning capabilities. I think Hampshire will probably end up being in the top half of the table. I think it's just a case of I don't know if they've got quite enough to really, really challenge for a title against Surrey. But we shall see, I guess, into the later half. And I think they find themselves about mid-table at the moment. And if I was a betting man, I'd probably say they'd finish around there to finish the season. Anyway, that's all for the Hampshire preview, and I really appreciate you if you're still watching now. Make sure to click the subscribe button if you're new to here, and there should be some more of the previews up on the video if you just want a little update on maybe how a team might be looking for the 2025 season. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. This has been the County Chat, and yeah, peace. Much love. Thank you very much for watching again.